Good morning. I'm Thomas Munson, and I'm coordinating a course at University of Victoria called Ecosystems of the Future. In this section of the program, we're looking at how people from different disciplines are relating to climate change in their work and also relating to ecological restoration. Today, I have my manager, Adriane Pollard, from the District of Saanich Environmental Services Division, and she's going to discuss planning as a discipline and how planning and climate change might relate to each other. Adriane, tell us about your role in the District of Saanich and how long you've been working there.
Sure. So I've been at the District of Saanich for over 20 years. I started as in Thomas's position and became the manager about 19 years ago. I have a background in ecology and planning, and that combination really works well for environmental planning.
So, how have you seen the natural world change over your time in Saanich? I know, like you, I grew up in Ontario, but in your time in Saanich, how have you seen the natural world change in relation to climate change in terms of things like invasive species, human land use, things like that?
Of course, there's been a lot more development that's happened, but things are changing in terms of development as we do more infilling and adding levels up as space becomes less available. But in terms of invasive species, there's been good and bad. There's been a lot more awareness of some of the traditional invasive species like broom and ivy, and partnerships between volunteer groups and local government to get rid of a lot of these invasive species. So there's been a real push in some of our more environmentally significant areas to remove these invasives. And then quite often you'll see the native species, which have been dormant for years, finally see the light of day. But then there's been a lot of species that have been taking advantage of disturbance through development, through gardening, through movement of soils from one place to another. So, for example, lesser celandine in riparian areas has become a big issue, and it basically will go wherever there is some bare soil.
So, what do you think will happen if climate change impacts increase on the Saanich Peninsula where we live in terms of longer drought season, milder but drier winters, less water in general, or increased fire?
Well, the Saanich Peninsula has always had the type of climate where our streams really struggle in the summer. So some streams dry up completely, others have very low environmental flows, which makes it a challenge for anything that requires water, not just fish, but any animals that come to use that water as a drinking source. So that is going to become more and more of an issue as the water gets lower and hotter. So we're going to really have to concentrate on riparian areas and increasing canopy cover, whether it's dense shrubs or tree canopy, to try to shade and cool the water. So that has a domino effect with the streams. The other thing is that there's a lot of area on the Saanich Peninsula that has very shallow soils, rocky areas where even our native species are struggling with the lack of water and the increased heat. So I think we're going to see a change in those areas, and hopefully it'll be other native species that fill in that niche rather than invasives.
In terms of your work in planning, how do you think you might apply climate change to planning decisions over the next 20 years?
Well, I think one of the main ones is going to be sea level rise, because Saanich has, well, the whole peninsula, of course, almost every municipality has a large area of waterfront, and we have erosion. We have very low-lying areas that are densely populated. So with king tides, tsunami threat, and rising sea levels, we're going to see more erosion, more homes close to, you know, being in real danger. Yeah. So I think that is a big focus right now in terms of planning and where housing should be and what precautions should be taken.
Yeah, house with a view may not be such a precious thing with sea level rise. Tell us, Adriane, how you've been involved with ecological restoration in your 20 years of Saanich.
Sure. Well, right behind me is my own example. This little Gary Oak knoll was covered in staghorn sumac and blackberries when I first came here, and I removed those, and I just throw handfuls of seeds on it over the years, and now I've got this beautiful camas and Gary Oak area with some arbutus, and so that's my own pet project.
Nice.
But in terms of my work, one of the earliest, well, two projects come to mind. One was we trained a large number of our staff in bioengineering, and that allowed us to have another option when it came to fixing stream banks, so that it wasn't always sandbanks, riprap, gabions, or concrete. We had the option of bioengineering, and a really nice example of that is at Emily Park, where there was a lot of erosion, a lot of sedimentation that had to be taken out every year, causing a lot of disturbance. And the banks were steep and full of invasive species. And they started off with creating a sump to collect the sediments so that the disturbance would be limited to one small area. And then the eroded banks, they used bioengineering. And then and that was our public works group. And then the Parks Department came in and did riparian planting. So the change over time has been quite dramatic in that area. So bioengineering has been a real hands-on change that our staff has been able to use in many locations. And then the other thing was the Gary Oak Restoration Program, which was research-based. It was a partnership between government and volunteers, and there were 10 or 12 locations where it was a spectrum of different oak habitats, from almost non-existent to really nice, needing different types of restoration. That's now morphed into more of a invasive species management program. But that restoration program was a real eye-opener for me, because there was a lot of research that was done to look at what was there historically, what's the soil composition like now, what's the seed bank like for invasive species, what's the hydrology, all sorts of data collecting that went on to create a baseline so that a restoration prescription could be created. So those are a couple of examples that have been long running in Saanich.
Do you think that ecological restoration has a role to play in responding to, say, the cedar dieback? What could we do there, or responding to invasive species replacement? How can ecological restoration play a role there?
Well, certainly education and awareness is a big player, because we can promote the use of species that will do well by both leading by example and also through our educational materials, letting people know good choices for various species. There's a lot of restoration that can happen. I might be moving on to the next question here.
That's fine.
There's a lot of restoration that can happen through development processes as well. So you can, as a local government, require restoration through various bylaws as a way of correcting in a non-compliance situation. So, for example, if someone brings in fill and destroys an area where they should not have filled, they can be required to remove the fill and restore the area. Also, in terms of just tree cutting, replacing trees, and development permit areas to protect the natural environment are a very strong tool when it comes to restoration, because you can require restoration for damage that was done at any time. So if somebody requires a permit to develop near a stream, you can require some stream restoration as part of their permit. There are limits to what you can ask a landowner to do. They don't necessarily have expertise, but if it's a subdivision or something that requires professionals, then they usually do have a professional biologist, and they can prescribe something and help them to restore a stream bank in a much more holistic manner than, say, removing blackberries and planting some trees, which is great, but you can go a bit further depending on the level of professionalism that's involved with the development application.
In the district of Saanich, we're living in an area that has one of the rarest ecosystems in the country, the Garry Oak ecosystem. And you made a very good point about biodiversity, and the existing biodiversity here in the Garry Oak ecosystem has been reduced to about 5% of its original level. And urban biodiversity, as you mentioned, is gaining some steam in planning circles, meaning let's consider reestablishing biodiversity in cities as we develop. Do you think Saanich has done much in that regard? And do other planners consider, first of all, protecting biodiversity as best as possible in Saanich, and then replacing it with other biodiversity from the same Garry Oak ecosystem?
Well, going back to, has Saanich done much in this regard? Really, environmental planning, it was sort of a thing in the 1970s. It wasn't really called environmental planning. It was just, urban planners that had environmental knowledge and interest, and they weren't the only ones. Lots of people have environmental knowledge and interest in professional circles as well. So there were some very forward things way back when. So Saanich created an urban containment boundary very early on, and that basically drew a line in the sand where between density and rural, whether it's farming or forests, and low density development. So that was one of the biggest things that occurred to help biodiversity. Another thing was 50 years ago, it was decided that the Colquitts River was a gem in Saanich and that it should be a public asset. And so over the years, Saanich has systematically purchased all the properties along the Colquitts, and now we have a linear park and many offshoots from it. And that is something that took a lot of foresight and perseverance to do that. So I think we have a lot of public land assets that are doing a good job at keeping biodiversity in Saanich. But there's, as I said before, competing interests, whether it's farming or housing, or even more cycling routes. Those are great. They're all great things, but they can chip away at the biodiversity that we do have. So one thing that we're trying to do is make sure that we have all these areas inventoried. We've had an atlas of all the known inventories since the late 90s, and we're just about to release our next edition, our 4th edition, and it'll pretty much double the amount of area that's been mapped in Saanich. So that's always seen as one of the first steps, is knowing where these areas are in advance. Somebody doesn't want to purchase a land thinking this is going to be a great development and then find out later, well, actually, you've got a rare ecosystem there, and we don't want you to necessarily put only houses there. We've been using natural state covenants in Saanich since the mid-90s, and that is fairly unusual for municipalities. So when developments would come up, these areas would become required to be preserved as part of a development, and those covenants run with the land as the homes are sold. The covenant stays in place. So we have been doing a lot of things. It's just that there's less and less land, and there's less and less ecosystem, as you've noted, and there's a real push for more housing. So it really puts planners and politicians in a difficult situation, and the role of the environmental planner is to try to point out these areas, suggest ways that they could be preserved through the development process and hopefully beyond, and how these areas could be restored before they change hands. There is a lot of that going on, but there's also a lot of, we'll keep that area, but this area here will become homes, and so you do still have losses. How we make up for that, I'm not really sure. There's acquiring more parkland, but that does not protect the ecosystems that we still have, because a lot of it is within private landowner hands. So I think right now, because climate change is at the forefront, you're seeing a lot of hiring of sustainability coordinators, sustainability managers, which is fantastic. And I think that environmental planners have been pretty stagnant for many years now in terms of take a look at how many municipalities have them, and on the island it's not that many. The lower mainland, they do have a lot, but they're few and far between on the island, and I'm hoping that as climate change is such a high issue in everybody's minds, that brings more perspective on biodiversity, and you'll see more, whether they're environmental planners or planners with an environmental interest, being the champion of the policies that are there, the bylaws that are there, and the ecosystems that are there to bring awareness and hopefully inspire developments that are green, as green as they can be. There's always going to be some destruction. And in Saanich, a lot of developers know that they need to come forward with covenants, with some naturescaping, using native plants to create habitat. And so they know that's a given. Whether it's enough in the long run, who's to say? I think already we've lost a lot of our Garryoak ecosystem, and the parts that are left, like this little one here, they're few and far between, and they need to have more connectivity through the landscape, whether it's through more Garryoak ecosystems or naturescaping, other types of ecosystems, greenways. Those are all things that we can strive for to become part of the urban landscape.
So finally, are you optimistic for the next 20 years of what might happen here?
Well, I'll be retired, but the work will go on, and I am optimistic because of climate change. Climate change, you don't often hear those words together, But in terms of biodiversity, I'm optimistic that because the climate change crisis, that biodiversity will suddenly be recognized again as important, and you'll see people doing more with their land to um, help on a community-wide basis. So that's my hope.
Great.